In the summer of 1462, deep in the heart of Wallachia, something so horrifying unfolded that it would make even the most battle-hardened Ottoman conquerors turn back in terror. Picture this: an army of nearly 100,000 soldiers, led by the man who had conquered Constantinople itself, advancing through a landscape that seemed emptied of all life. No defenders in sight, no resistance, just an eerie silence that whispered of something far worse than any battle they had ever fought. Then they saw it. Rising from the earth like a grotesque forest, thousands upon thousands of wooden stakes pierced the sky, each one crowned with the rotting corpse of an Ottoman soldier. The stench of death hung thick in the air, and even the ravens seemed hesitant to approach this monument to human cruelty. At the center of this macabre display, impaled on the tallest stake of all, was the decomposing body of Hamza Pasha, a high-ranking Ottoman official whose arms and legs had been severed before his torment began. This was the handiwork of one man, a prince whose very name would echo through the corridors of history, inspiring both terror and legend. Vlad III, known to his enemies as Țepeș, the Impaler. What happened at Târgoviște in 1462 was not just a battle or a siege. It was psychological warfare elevated to an art form so brutal, so calculated, that it would force the mighty Ottoman Empire to retreat from a vastly outnumbered enemy. But how did it come to this? How did a relatively small principality manage to terrorize the most powerful empire of its time? The answer lies in the twisted genius of a man who understood that sometimes the most effective weapon is not steel or gunpowder, but pure, unadulterated fear. To understand the horror that unfolded at Târgoviște, we must first travel back to the events that set this nightmare in motion. The year 1462 had begun with tensions already boiling between Wallachia and the Ottoman Empire. Vlad had done the unthinkable. He had refused to pay the haras, the annual tribute that the Ottomans demanded from their Christian neighbors, but his defiance went far beyond mere financial resistance. When Sultan Mehmed II sent 2 envoys to demand not only tribute, but personal homage from the Wallachian prince, Vlad's response was characteristically brutal. The envoys were seized, and in a display of contempt that would seal his fate, Vlad had them impaled. This was not just an insult to Ottoman authority. It was a declaration of war against the man who had toppled the Byzantine Empire and earned himself the title of conqueror. The Sultan's rage was immediate and absolute, but Vlad was not content to wait for retaliation. In February of 1462, he launched a devastating preemptive strike across the Danube into Ottoman territory. What followed was a campaign of such systematic brutality that it shocked even the hardened chroniclers of the age. Vlad divided his army into smaller, more mobile units, covering over 800 kilometers in just 2 weeks, as they swept through Bulgaria like a plague. Villages were razed, towns were emptied, and everywhere the Wallachian forces passed, they left behind their signature calling card: forests of impaled Ottoman soldiers and civilians. The death toll was staggering. In a letter to King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, Vlad himself boasted of the carnage. "We killed 23,884 Turks without counting those whom we burned in homes, or the Turks whose heads were cut by our soldiers. These were not the actions of a madman, but the calculated moves of a strategic genius who understood that terror could accomplish what conventional warfare could not." Every impaled body was a message. Every burning village was a warning. The small principality of Wallachia was announcing to the world that it would not bow to Ottoman supremacy. When news of this massacre reached Constantinople, Mehmed's response was swift and overwhelming. He assembled an army that rivaled the force he had used to conquer the greatest city in Christendom. Nearly 90,000 soldiers marched north, a tide of steel and fury that seemed capable of washing away any resistance. Janissaries in their distinctive white caps, Sipahi cavalry with their curved sabers, engineers with siege equipment, and countless auxiliaries from across the empire. This was not merely an army, it was the empire itself on the march. Against this overwhelming force, Vlad could muster perhaps 30,000 men, peasants and shepherds armed with spears and bows, a small number of boyar cavalry in chainmail, and his personal guard of international mercenaries. The disparity was crushing. 3 Ottoman soldiers for every Wallachian defender. Any conventional military strategist would have counseled immediate surrender or flight. But Vlad was not conventional. As the Ottoman horde crossed the Danube at Nikopol on the 4th of June, the Wallachian prince was already implementing a strategy that would define the campaign. He would not meet the Ottomans in open battle, where their superior numbers would guarantee victory. Instead, he would transform Wallachia itself into a weapon. The scorched earth policy that followed was implemented with ruthless precision. As the Ottoman army advanced toward the capital of Târgoviște, they found only emptiness. Crops were burned in the fields. Wells were poisoned. Villages stood abandoned. Their inhabitants vanished like ghosts. Every step deeper into Wallachian territory brought the invaders further from their supply lines and closer to starvation. But this was merely the prelude to something far more sinister. As the Ottomans pushed deeper into the country, they began to find signs of what awaited them. Isolated stakes bearing the bodies of Turkish scouts. Small groups of impaled prisoners left as warnings along the roads. The psychological pressure was mounting with every mile, every day, every gruesome discovery. Meanwhile, Vlad was preparing his masterpiece. In the shadows of the Carpathian Mountains, far from Ottoman eyes, his men were busy with their grisly work. Thousands of Ottoman prisoners taken during the Bulgarian raids were being subjected to the most horrific torture known to medieval warfare. The process was methodical, almost ritualistic in its precision. The stakes were carefully prepared, sharpened to a point but not too sharp, for a quick death was not the goal. The wooden poles were often oiled to ease their passage through human flesh, ensuring that the victim would survive the initial impalement and endure hours or even days of agony. The stake would be inserted through the rectum or vagina. Then the victim's own weight would slowly drag them down, forcing the wood up through their torso until it emerged from the throat or shoulder. Some victims were impaled upside down for greater humiliation. Others had their limbs severed before the stakes were driven through their bodies. The height of each stake was determined by the rank of the victim, creating a grotesque hierarchy of suffering. And all the while, Vlad supervised the process with the detached efficiency of a craftsman perfecting his art. By the time the Ottoman army approached Târgoviște in late June, everything was ready. The capital appeared deserted, its gates standing open as if in surrender. But as Mehmed's forces entered the city, they discovered that this was no surrender. It was an invitation to witness something that would haunt the empire for generations to come. The forest of the Impaled stretched for miles. 20,000 bodies arranged in concentric circles, their decomposing forms creating a monument to human cruelty that defied comprehension. The sight was so overwhelming that hardened Ottoman veterans, men who had stormed the walls of Constantinople and fought in dozens of campaigns, simply stopped and stared in horror. At the center of this nightmare stood the tallest stake of all, bearing the mutilated remains of Hamza Pasha. The Ottoman commander had been given special treatment before his execution. His arms and legs had been methodically severed, and his torso impaled on a stake that towered above all others, a twisted symbol of his former rank and authority. The message was unmistakable. No Ottoman, regardless of position or power, was beyond Vlad's reach. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. These were not random acts of violence, but a carefully orchestrated display designed to shatter the morale of an entire army. The bodies had been arranged with geometric precision, creating patterns that spoke of methodical planning rather than chaotic brutality. Some stakes formed perfect circles. Others created intricate designs that could only be appreciated from elevated positions, as if Vlad had created this horror as a work of twisted art. Birds had made nests in the rib cages of the dead. Maggots writhed through rotting flesh. The summer heat intensified the stench until it became a physical presence, choking the air and forcing even the most disciplined soldiers to cover their faces. Many Ottoman troops simply could not continue. They fell to their knees, retching, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the atrocity before them. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the details that emerged as the army moved through this forest of death. Among the impaled were not just soldiers, but women and children, mothers clutching infants, both skewered on the same stake. Entire families arranged in grotesque tableaux that spoke of systematic extermination. The Wallachians had not simply killed their prisoners, they had orchestrated a symphony of suffering that challenged the very concept of human decency. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, the man who had brought down the last remnant of the Roman Empire, stood transfixed before this display. Contemporary chroniclers describe his reaction with words that seem almost inadequate to convey the moment. He was, they wrote, seized with amazement. The Sultan who had ordered the execution of thousands without blinking, who had turned the Hagia Sophia into a mosque and scattered the bones of Byzantine emperors, found himself speechless before Vlad's handiwork. The Ottoman army, which had marched into Wallachia with the confidence of conquerors, began to whisper among themselves. These were men who had seen the worst that medieval warfare could offer. They had stormed cities, sacked towns, and participated in the brutal realities of imperial expansion.
We must leave.
Yet nothing in their experience had prepared them for this systematic display of calculated cruelty. The stakes themselves told a story of meticulous preparation. Each wooden pole had been carefully selected and shaped. The points were rounded rather than sharp, designed to prolong rather than hasten death. The wood had been treated with oils and animal fat to ease penetration, while ensuring that victims would survive the initial impalement. This was not the work of savages acting in the heat of battle, but the product of cold, methodical planning. As the Ottoman forces moved deeper into the forest of death, they began to understand the true scope of Vlad's psychological warfare. The impaled bodies were arranged so that visitors would encounter them in a specific sequence, each discovery more horrifying than the last. Common soldiers were impaled on shorter stakes near the perimeter. Officers occupied taller poles in the inner circles, and at the very center, like the altar of some demonic temple, stood Hamza Pasha's mutilated form. The chronicler, Chalco Condyles, writing years later, struggled to find words adequate to describe the scene. He spoke of an area covering more than 7 acres, where 20,000 souls had been subjected to the most agonizing death imaginable. The precision of his numbers suggests that someone, perhaps Vlad himself, had kept careful count of the victims. This was not random slaughter, but an inventory of terror. The effect on Ottoman morale was precisely what Vlad had calculated. Soldiers who had faced death on countless battlefields found themselves unable to sleep. The image of those rotting corpses, arranged in their geometric patterns, haunted their dreams. Officers reported that men were deserting in growing numbers, slipping away in the night rather than face another day in this charnel house. Sultan Mehmed, for all his reputation as a conqueror, recognized that he faced something unprecedented. This was not an enemy who could be defeated through conventional means. Vlad had transformed warfare itself, turning death into art and suffering into strategy. The Ottoman army had encountered rebels before, but never one who could make the earth itself a weapon of terror. The Sultan's advisors urged different courses of action. Some called for an immediate assault on Vlad's remaining forces, arguing that swift victory would erase the psychological impact of the forest of death. Others counseled retreat, recognizing that an army demoralized by such displays would be vulnerable in battle. The debate raged in Mehmed's pavilion as the stench of 20,000 corpses drifted through the camp. Meanwhile, Vlad remained hidden in the mountains, watching and waiting. He knew that the forest of impaled bodies was working its dark magic on the Ottoman psyche. Every hour that passed with those stakes standing in silent testimony to his methods was another hour of psychological victory. The longer the Ottoman army remained in the shadow of his handiwork, the more their confidence would erode. The strategic brilliance of the display became increasingly apparent as days passed. Vlad had not simply killed his enemies. He had created a monument to fear that would influence every decision the Ottomans made. Supply lines became precarious as soldiers refused to venture far from the main army. Foraging parties returned with reports of more impaled bodies found along remote trails. Even the act of sleeping became torment as men imagined themselves on those wooden stakes. The psychological warfare that Vlad had unleashed went beyond mere intimidation. It struck at something primal in the human psyche, challenging the very foundations of Ottoman military culture. These were soldiers who prided themselves on discipline, who had conquered nations through superior organization and unwavering courage. Yet here they stood, paralyzed by the sight of what one man's imagination could conjure from wood and flesh. As word of the forest of death spread through the Ottoman ranks, a strange transformation began to take hold. Veterans who had fought at the walls of Constantinople found themselves unable to explain what they were witnessing to younger soldiers. How do you describe 20,000 human beings arranged like some macabre garden? How do you convey the methodical precision with which each stake had been positioned, each body displayed? The geometric patterns became increasingly disturbing the longer one studied them. Vlad had not simply impaled his victims randomly. The concentric circles created pathways that forced visitors to walk among the dead, ensuring that no one could pass through without confronting the full scope of his work. The varying heights of the stakes created a twisted skyline that could be seen from miles away, a constant reminder of what awaited those who opposed the Wallachian prince. But it was the attention to detail that truly unnerved the Ottoman commanders. The stakes had been planted with surveyor's precision. The spacing between them allowed for maximum visual impact, while ensuring that the stench would concentrate in specific areas. Even the orientation of the bodies seemed calculated, positioned so that their sightless eyes would stare directly at approaching visitors. Sultan Mehmed found himself returning repeatedly to observe this monument to cruelty. Contemporary accounts describe him walking among the stakes in silence, his face unreadable as he studied Vlad's handiwork. The man who had ordered the execution of entire noble families, who had transformed conquered cities into graveyards, seemed genuinely shaken by what he encountered at Târgoviște. The Sultan's fascination was not merely morbid curiosity. He recognized that he was witnessing something revolutionary in the art of warfare. Vlad had discovered how to weaponize death itself, transforming corpses into instruments of psychological destruction, more effective than any siege engine or cavalry charge. The forest of impaled bodies represented a new form of military strategy, one that attacked the mind rather than the body. As the Ottoman army struggled to maintain its composure in the shadow of this grotesque display, reports began filtering in from across Wallachia of similar discoveries. Smaller forests of stakes were found along major roads, each containing dozens or hundreds of impaled Ottoman soldiers. These were not afterthoughts or random acts of violence, but part of a comprehensive campaign designed to terrorize an entire empire. The systematic nature of Vlad's terror campaign became increasingly apparent as Ottoman scouts ventured deeper into Wallachian territory. Every crossroads seemed to feature its own collection of stakes. Every village that had been abandoned contained evidence of methodical torture. The Wallachian prince had transformed his entire principality into a theater of horror, with each gruesome discovery serving as another act in his psychological drama. The impact on Ottoman supply lines was immediate and devastating. Soldiers refused to venture far from the main army, fearing that they too might end up decorating Vlad's wooden forest. Foraging became nearly impossible as men imagined, impaled bodies lurking behind every tree, around every bend in the road. The very landscape seemed contaminated by the presence of so much death. Medical personnel accompanying the Ottoman army reported a surge in cases of what they could only describe as battlefield madness. Soldiers who had never shown signs of weakness suddenly became unable to function. Some refused to eat, claiming that the stench of rotting flesh had permanently destroyed their appetite. Others suffered from nightmares so vivid that they could not distinguish between sleep and waking horror. The Ottoman military hierarchy, built on centuries of discipline and proven tactics, began to crack under the psychological pressure. Officers found themselves unable to maintain order as rumors spread through the ranks like wildfire. Some claimed that Vlad possessed supernatural powers, that he could appear anywhere at any time to claim new victims for his wooden forest. Others whispered that the Wallachian prince had made a pact with dark forces, trading his soul for the power to inflict such exquisite suffering. These superstitions, normally dismissed by rational military minds, took root in soil fertilized by genuine terror. When hardened warriors cannot explain what they are witnessing through conventional understanding, they inevitably turn to supernatural explanations. Vlad's reputation began to transform from that of a cruel but mortal enemy into something approaching mythological status. The chroniclers traveling with the Ottoman army struggled to find adequate language to describe what they were documenting. Their accounts, written for audiences back in Constantinople, seem almost apologetic in their inability to convey the full horror of the scene. Words like numerous, and many give way to precise counts that suggest someone had methodically tallied the dead. 20,000 impaled bodies. 7 acres of human suffering. These were not estimates born of chaos, but the careful accounting of systematic terror. The precision extended to the torture methods themselves. Ottoman soldiers who survived their encounters with Wallachian forces brought back detailed accounts of the impalement process. The stakes were prepared with almost ritualistic care, their surfaces treated to ensure maximum suffering while preventing rapid death. The positioning of victims followed established protocols, with rank and status determining not only the height of the stake, but also the manner of torture preceding impalement. Some prisoners had been subjected to preliminary torments designed to enhance their final agony. Limbs were severed in specific sequences, calculated to cause maximum pain while keeping the victim conscious. Eyes were removed, so that the condemned could not see their fate approaching. Tongues were cut out to prevent final curses or prayers. Every aspect of the process seemed designed not merely to kill, but to break the human spirit completely before death provided its mercy. The psychological impact of these revelations rippled through the Ottoman camp like a plague. Soldiers who had previously boasted of their courage in battle found themselves unable to sleep without imagining themselves subjected to similar torments. The very act of closing one's eyes became an invitation to nightmares populated by wooden stakes and screaming victims. Sultan Mehmed's inner circle watched their leader with growing concern as he spent hours studying the forest of impaled bodies. The man who had conquered Constantinople seemed genuinely haunted by what he had discovered in this remote Wallachian capital. His usual decisive nature gave way to long periods of contemplation as he walked among the stakes, seemingly lost in thought. The strategic implications of Vlad's psychological warfare became increasingly clear as the Ottoman army struggled to maintain its operational effectiveness. This was not merely about the 20, but about the message their deaths conveyed to every 1,000 souls impaled at Târgoviște Ottoman soldier. The empire that had seemed invincible suddenly appeared vulnerable to a new form of warfare that attacked the mind rather than the body. The forest of death stood as testament to the power of imagination unleashed from all moral constraints. Vlad had not simply killed his enemies. He had transformed their deaths into a work of art so disturbing that it challenged the very foundations of military psychology. Every stake represented not just a life ended, but a calculated blow against the morale of an entire empire. As the Ottoman army prepared to continue its campaign deeper into Wallachia, the shadow of those 20,000 impaled bodies stretched far beyond the physical boundaries of Târgoviște. The psychological wounds inflicted by Vlad's forest of death would prove more lasting than any injuries sustained in conventional battle. The Wallachian prince had discovered something that would haunt the Ottoman Empire for generations, that sometimes the most effective weapon against a superior enemy is not courage or cleverness, but the willingness to embrace horrors that normal minds cannot even conceive. The stage was now set for the most audacious gambit in Vlad's campaign of terror. Having demonstrated his capacity for systematic cruelty, the Wallachian prince was ready to prove that his tactical genius matched his appetite for psychological warfare. What happened next would transform a desperate defensive campaign into one of the most legendary military actions in medieval history. The night of June 17th, 1462, would prove that Vlad's mastery extended far beyond the art of torture. As Sultan Mehmed's vast army settled into their camp outside Târgoviște, confident that their overwhelming numbers guaranteed victory, the Wallachian prince was already moving through the darkness, like a specter of vengeance. What followed was perhaps the most audacious military gambit in medieval warfare. Just before midnight, as Ottoman sentries peered into the black void beyond their camp's perimeter, a figure approached the main gate. Speaking in flawless Turkish, the rider demanded entry, his voice carrying the authority of high rank. In the darkness, with thousands of soldiers moving about the camp, one more mounted figure seemed unremarkable. The guard opened the gate. Vlad the Impaler rode boldly into the heart of the Ottoman encampment, followed by a carefully selected force of horsemen who flowed through the entrance like wolves slipping into a sheepfold. Their disguises held long enough for most of the Wallachian force to penetrate deep into the enemy camp before the terrible truth was discovered. Then chaos erupted. Torches blazed to life as Wallachian warriors threw off their Ottoman cloaks and revealed their true nature. The night filled with the sound of bugles and war cries as Vlad's men carved through the camp like a blade through silk. Tents burst into flames. Horses and camels, panicked by the sudden violence, trampled their own handlers as they fled into the darkness. Supply wagons became funeral pyres, their contents feeding fires that turned night into hellish day. The attack was not random violence but surgical precision. Vlad had spent precious time before the assault studying the Ottoman camp's layout, memorizing the positions of key commanders, and identifying the location of Sultan Mehmed's personal pavilion. This was not the desperate charge of a cornered enemy, but the calculated strike of a master tactician who understood that terror was most effective when combined with tactical brilliance. The forest of 20,000 impaled souls at Târgoviște became more than a monument to cruelty. It became proof that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through superior numbers or advanced weapons, but through the willingness to embrace what others dare not even imagine. Vlad the Impaler had achieved something that would echo through the centuries, transforming wooden stakes into instruments of terror, so effective that they could turn back the mightiest empire on earth. His legacy reminds us that in the darkest chapters of history, the human capacity for both horror and strategic brilliance knows no bounds.